So today is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Emily Packard Dawson, who is the latest bioethics postdoctoral research fellow, both in Michigan Bioethics and the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. Before coming to us at U of M, she directed the congressionally requested National Academy's consensus study, Newborn Screening, Current Landscapes and Future Directions, where we met. It's a great place to recruit. And contributed to a workshop on in vitro gametogenesis as a Marzanian Science and Technology Policy Fellow. A developmental biologist by training, she earned her PhD in cell and molecular biology from Baylor College of Medicine. And next fall, we are very excited to announce that she'll be continuing her bioethics training as a fellow in the ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics and genomics at the University of Pennsylvania's T32, which is excellent news. She'll get great training there. Her work focuses on the ethical and policy dimensions of emerging technologies and genetic services that impact health and reproduction. And I had the privilege of reading this article through that she's presenting several times. And it's great, and I'm really proud of her. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Packard Dawson.
Thank you so much, Kate, for the kind introduction and the opportunity to speak and share my work with all of you today. It's been an amazing experience serving as the Michigan Bioethics Fellow this year. I've learned so much from everyone in the room and many people online, and it's wonderful to have the chance to connect in person today. As Kate mentioned, I'm a developmental biologist by training. My background informs my long-term goal to bring hard science and ethics into conversation, especially around emerging technologies that impact reproduction. For the next step in my career journey, Kate also mentioned, I'll be continuing my training at Penn this fall. Today, I want to share a paper I'm working on, and it's a tricky topic, and I genuinely welcome your thoughts on the framing and the argument. But first, I want to start by saying there are few things more personal than building a family. Assisted reproductive technologies have made that possible for many people who would otherwise not have the option. But some of these pathways to parenthood depend on individuals who bear real medical burdens to help others build their families. And this talk is about what we owe them and what happens when technology advances in ways that shift the conditions of that burden before we've built adequate protections for the people who bear it. This is the part where I figure out how to use this. All right, it turns off, and then sometimes you have to do it off. You know what? It's all good because there's slides things here. There we go. All right. People choose their partners, and who you choose to have children with is one of the most personal decisions anyone can ever make. Maybe you're drawn to someone with particular physical features, a particular background, education, faith, etc. And we generally think that's fine. It's autonomy, it's personal intimacy. And in the United States, although not all countries, in the United States, people have that same autonomy when choosing an egg donor. Egg donors contribute their DNA to a future child, and intended parents choose them based on how they might shape that child's identity. Maybe as listed on this ad for a, quote, high IQ, or a, quote, specific aesthetic, or a certain, quote, gift or talent. They aren't picking any donor, but a specific person, an ideal person for them. And no single intended parent sits down and thinks, I'm going to shape a reproductive market. They're just trying to build their specific family, but aggregate those individual choices for a person with a high IQ or a specific look and multiply them across hundreds of thousands of cycles and hundreds of millions of dollars. And you end up with an egg donor market that has some pretty significant eugenic dimensions. Now let's imagine that there's a technology that could decouple genetic contribution from egg donation entirely. You would still need a donor egg, but only for its cytoplasm. And the intended parent's DNA would be what would get passed on to the future child. So the donor wouldn't contribute any nuclear DNA. This sounds like progress. It could dissolve the eugenic logic of the marketplace. If the donor's genetics don't matter, you stop selecting for Ivy League credentials, race, athletic achievements. The market stops sorting people by their perceived heritable worth. And that sounds good. And it might be in that respect. But here's where things get quite uncomfortable. If the donor's genetics don't matter, then donors may become more interchangeable. And we have a pretty good sense of what happens when labor becomes interchangeable. And in fact, egg donation does already have some serious problems. Many have criticized it for inadequate consent procedures, unknown long-term risks, financial inducement, and those problems exist now, even with the selectivity still intact. So look at what happens in markets where labor is perceived as more interchangeable. Surrogacy, especially in a transnational context, is one of the clearest examples. When gestational carriers are chosen not for heritable traits, but simply for their willingness to undergo medically supervised reproductive labor, those markets have proven deeply vulnerable to coercion and exploitation. The people who bear the physical burden are rarely the ones with the power. So here's the uncomfortable tension at the heart of this talk. The eugenic dimensions of the egg donor marketplace are obviously bad, but they have incidentally, by accident, provided some protection to egg donors because the traits that make them a desirable donor in the current market tend to cluster with structural privilege. Select for education, and you end up with a donor pool that tends to have health insurance, health literacy, and more economic stability. Which brings us to the question, what happens when a technological advance removes constraints that were providing incidental protections to the people participating in a practice? And how do we build intentional and anticipatory governance before the science moves and takes those incidental protections with it? So to think about answering that, we need to understand both the science and the market. And so here's where we're going. I'll start with the scientific context so that we can understand what kinds of emerging ART could decouple egg donation and genetic contribution. Then I'll turn to egg donation as it currently exists, the practice, the risks, and how the market's structured. From there, I'll develop what I'm calling the theory of the technological shadow, which is really what I would invite a lot of critique and input and feedback on. I'll then ask who donates in a post-genetic market and under what conditions. And I'll close with governance, the challenges, the policy window, and specific safeguards. Okay. Let's dive into the science, which sometimes feels like my bread and butter and I feel safest talking about, and what kind of reproductive technology you could still rely on egg donation, but decouple it from genetic contribution. It's an emerging reproductive technology, in vitro gametogenesis, or the creation of eggs and sperm from stem cells in the laboratory. I'll use this graphic to explain how it works. So let's imagine Sam and Bodhi, and they're a couple hoping to conceive a child that's genetically related to both of them. But when Sam was a kid, she received cancer treatment and she has no eggs as a result. Currently, Sam and Bodhi could use donor eggs and Bodhi's sperm to conceive a child, but with IVG, they could create an egg in the laboratory using Sam's somatic cells, so like skin cells, blood cells. Using that lab-derived egg and Bodhi's sperm, they can do IVF and have a baby. This is the goal for IVG, to expand access to genetically related parenthood for people who face biological or social barriers to reproduction. That promise has generated enormous excitement and enormous controversy. Debates over whether IVG should be permitted, restricted, or prohibited are underway among scientists, clinicians, legal scholars, bioethicists, and they remain unresolved and deeply contested. Today's talk isn't going to settle those debates, but I'm trying to add an additional dimension that I think has been missing, one that comes into view when you look carefully at the different approaches to achieving IVG. So the ambitious long-term vision driving much of this research is the generation of gametes entirely from induced pluripotent stem cells. So those are iPSCs. They're differentiated cells, such as skin cells or blood cells, reprogrammed back to a state where they can become any cell type, including eggs or sperm. And this wouldn't require donor eggs at all. If ever achieved and clinically available, this would fundamentally reshape reproductive medicine. And it's ethically appealing. We would no longer have to rely on another individual incurring medical risks to gain eggs to enable family formation for others. And in mice, researchers have already demonstrated the full promise of IVG, generating functional eggs and sperm from iPSCs and producing viable offspring, pictured here, and even offspring from those offspring. But translating creating lab-derived eggs from iPSCs to humans has proven very difficult. Human gametes seem to follow more complex cues and timing than those in mice, and scientists have struggled to recreate those physiological conditions in the laboratory. As a result, fully iPSC-derived human eggs capable of fertilization and development currently remain out of reach. Given those obstacles, some scientists are pursuing a different route, one that sidesteps some of the bottlenecks related to working from iPSCs. You may know the technique that these scientists are using from the famous case of Dolly the sheep. Somatic cell nuclear transfer, or SCNT, has been used for decades across species for reproductive and therapeutic cloning. Here's the basic idea. You take a donated egg, remove its nucleus, then you insert the nucleus from a mature specialized cell, a skin cell, into that hollowed out egg. The egg cytoplasm does something remarkable. It reprograms the transfer nucleus, stripping away its specialized identity and restoring it to this more flexible state. And the result is an egg that can develop into an embryo, genetically identical to whoever produced and provided that nucleus. So this is the technique that researchers are adapting for IVG. So instead of developing into an embryo, they're undergoing various mechanisms and procedures to encourage that embryo to become an egg. Here's what makes the SCNT based, and frankly, I'd love to get into that more later, but there's not time, so if anyone's curious about that, we can chat after. Here's what makes the SCNT based approach to IVG so interesting and so ethically consequential. The donor egg contributes no nuclear DNA, no heritable traits, nothing that will be passed to any future child. The intended parent's nucleus is what goes in, the intended parent's DNA and heritability is what comes out. But you still need the egg. You need its cytoplasmic environment, its reprogramming machinery. The donor is still essential. They're just not contributing genetically. And last year, this approach cleared a major hurdle. Researchers at Oregon Health and Science University used skin cells to create human eggs in the lab and then fertilize them. And for the first time ever, those fertilized eggs developed into embryos, reaching the blastocyst stage. No embryos were cultured past day 6, which is the standard time point for clinical embryo transfer and preimplantation genetic testing. The embryos had vast chromosomal abnormalities, so this is not a clinical breakthrough, but it is proof of concept, and the key elements of egg formation can be activated outside the body. And crucially, those lab-derived eggs still required a donated and nucleated egg to make all this work. So here's where we land. Egg donation doesn't go away, it just changes shape. The donor still undergoes the hormone stimulation, still undergoes the retrieval, still bears the medical burden, but now she doesn't contribute, at least in our sort of collective consciousness, into who that child will be. And that shift, eggs needed but not for their DNA, is what the rest of the talk is about. A decade. Some researchers think that's all the time it will take before the first in human use for IVG. And this reflects the scale of scientific investment and commercial interest already flowing into this space. And the momentum and substantial appetite for IVG matter. Whichever pathway reaches clinical viability first will be pursued, if not in the United States, which does have some regulatory barriers, then in jurisdictions with fewer ones. Which means that as long as donor-dependent approaches remain viable, egg donation stays in the picture. And while the donor's genetics may be irrelevant to the equation, the donor's body is not. So that's the situation that we might be heading into. And to understand what's at stake, we need to look carefully at what egg donation is, who does it, what does it cost them, and how the market that has grown around it actually functions. Egg donation makes something possible for one person by requiring something of another. The intended parent gets a path to parenthood. The donor receives compensation and assumes medical risk, some of it characterized, some of it not. Benefits and burdens don't fall on the same person. That asymmetry is not unique to egg donation. It appears wherever one person's medical or reproductive goals depends on another person's body. But it takes a particular shape here because a substantial commercial industry has grown up around egg donation that profits from mediating this asymmetry, recruiting the people who will bear the burdens, matching them with people who will receive the benefits, and setting the terms under which that exchange happens. The market around this has structured who bears those burdens and what resources they bring to them. So to understand what IVG stands to change and why it matters, let's look carefully at how that distribution currently works. Forgive me while I have a sip of water. The scale of the egg donation industry is not small. Donor eggs are used in more than 10% of all IVF cycles in the United States, rising to 20% for women over 40. The US donor market generates more than $350 million annually, and there are estimates of about $4 billion globally. This is a mature, profit-driven industry, and it is growing. So what does the person on the burden-bearing side of that exchange actually go through? So the procedure for egg donation is identical to what someone undergoing IVF would experience. So weeks of self-administered hormone injections followed by transvaginal egg retrieval under sedation. The critical difference is that in IVF, the person assuming those risks is also the person who will have the child. And in egg donation, those two people are not the same. Short-term risks are reasonably well characterized. Common side effects, bloating, cramping, mood swings, fatigue are manageable for most. More serious complications include ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, are generally described as rare but not negligible. The recent retrospective survey suggests that incidences of these more major events may be unreported, with the usual caveats that these surveys likely have self-selection and recall bias among respondents. The long-term picture is murkier. Follow-up studies of egg donors specifically are absent. Donors themselves have self-reported concerns about fertility, cancer risk, and reproductive aging, but the field is not followed up systematically. And what limited data do exist are primarily drawn from IVF populations, but it's not a great comparison. Egg donors are younger, they're typically healthy, and may donate multiple times. And comparing fertility between IVF patients and egg donors is particularly difficult, considering that IVF patients are usually experiencing issues with fertility challenges. Further, a recent study in JAMA Network Open points to increased risk for certain cancers among those who do use fertility treatments, pointing to the fact that this really isn't so clear even among people who are doing IVF for themselves. Either way, the absence of data has been interpreted and in some cases actively presented as the absence of risk, and that's not the same thing. And that uncertainty compounds with each additional cycle. Many donors donate more than once, and the industry has financial incentives to recruit high-performing donors repeatedly. Risks that appear manageable per cycle may accumulate in ways we cannot currently detect because we haven't built the registries or follow-up infrastructure to find out. Scholars and advocates have been raising alarms about the system for years: inadequate informed consent, low longitudinal follow-up, cumulative risk from repeated donations, financial inducement that shades into coercion, donors who are treated as peripheral to a process built around their bodies. None of these concerns are new. Many of them have not been adequately addressed, and all of them would persist if IVG advances through donor-dependent pathways. So we've established what egg donation costs the people who do it, and now the question is, why does the market recruit the people it does? And the answer lies in how eggs are valued. In the current donor market, eggs are valued for what they could transmit to a future child. Intended parents are not selecting a medical service provider. They're selecting a person, a specific person they envision contributing to their future child's identity. Appearance, intelligence, character, and as that ad makes plain, it's not any donor, it's a perfect donor. Donor profiles read accordingly: race, ethnicity, educational attainment, physical features, SAT scores, athletic achievements, artistic talents, all functioning as proxies for heritable traits that intended parents hope will be passed on to their child. And the more you're willing to pay, the more granular your preferences can be. This is not incidental to the market. It is the market. The entire infrastructure, the profiles, the photos, the searchable trait databases, the tiered compensation exists to facilitate the selection. Educational attainment is particularly prominent in the selection logic, used as a proxy for heritable cognitive abilities. So 85% of donors had at least some post-secondary education at the time of donation. And in a large retrospective survey of over 1,000 egg donors, more than 75% reported that they'd earned a bachelor's degree or higher. And that's compared to 38% of US adults in general per the US Census. A focus on educational status runs through materials agencies and banks produce, the ads, the profiles, the guidance documents. Recruitment is disproportionately targeted college campuses, so that ad on the right is not unusual. But it actually surfaces in all kinds of ways. So here, for instance, is actual guidance from Shady Grove Fertility on how to obtain childhood photos for your donor profile. Quote, "Not sure how to discreetly ask for copies of childhood photos? Egg donors have shared that they acquired these by saying it was for a school project, or even out of curiosity." So as you can see, educational attainment is an example of how participation in the donor market has not been demographically random, and that matters. Donor selection practices aren't just expression of individual preferences, as I alluded at the beginning of this talk. They reflect broader dynamics of stratified reproduction, the ways in which social systems differentially enable and constrain reproductive possibilities based on race, class, and other axes of inequality and inequity. And they operate through what scholars have called market-mediated eugenic logic, one that reinforces hierarchies not through state coercion, but through aggregated choices of individual consumers selecting and valuing genetic material in a marketplace. Sociologists studying the fertility industry have documented how this plays out around race specifically. Selecting a donor based on race can function as establishing familial resemblance. And given that ART recipients in the United States are disproportionately white, racial matching in practice often means selecting for whiteness. But whiteness can also operate as a separately valued heritable asset in its own right. The sociologist Amrita Pandey documents what she calls something strategic hybridization, where intended parents who do not self-identify as white intentionally select donors who do self-identify as white to conceive multiracial children with, quote, the best of both worlds. The desired outcome isn't resemblance, it's the perceived advantages of whiteness passed on to the next generation. This dynamic is visible in the US context too. Arthur Leo, father of Olympic figure skater and gold medalist Elisa Leo, told a Sports Illustrated reporter that he intentionally chose a Caucasian egg donor for his children because he felt they would benefit from a diverse gene pool and a multicultural upbringing. Whatever his intentions, the logic Pandey describes is operating at least in part. Whiteness is something to select for, framed as an intimate personal choice. Consistent with both dynamics, donors who self-identify as white self-report higher compensation than donors who self-identify as Black. No single intended parent thinks of themselves as participating in a eugenic market, but individual choices have collective consequences, and those consequences both reflect and reinforce existing hierarchies, and this is the market that IVG could transform. If SCNT-based IVG were to advance toward clinical application, egg donation wouldn't disappear, but it would be transformed. So again, the donor wouldn't contribute nuclear DNA to the future child, so intended parents wouldn't choose eggs based on what they could contribute to a future child's identity. The market logic would shift from selection, choosing a donor for their traits, to screening, passing medical eligibility, age, ovarian reserve, et cetera. And this shift could mitigate the eugenic dimensions embedded in current donor selection processes. But donors could also be selected and valued less as individuals and seen as more interchangeable. And that matters because donors have historically been, and the structural circumstances under which they participate is ethically relevant. Let me take stock of where we are so far. We've established that the only approach to lead to a fertilizable human lab-derived egg still relied on donor eggs. Donor-dependent IVG preserves all the medical burdens of egg donation, but transforms how eggs are valued. The current market, organized around genetic contribution, has produced a donor pool with a particular demographic shape. So before we ask what could change, let's think about what the implications of the demographic shape might be. So again, here's where things get tricky. We see the eugenic dimensions of the current market for egg donors. Selecting donors based on race, educational attainment, perceived cognitive ability reinforces hierarchies through aggregated individual choices. That's ethically problematic. But I'm here to make an argument that I find a little uncomfortable to make, that those same dimensions have incidentally and by accident produced a donor pool with structural resources that may buffer against some harms produced during the process of egg donation, not by design, not because anyone planned it, as a byproduct of how science has shaped the market. And it's certainly not a reason to preserve what we currently have going. But as I'm about to show you, these incidental protections are real, and they can meaningfully reduce harm for the donors who benefit from them. They're fragile, they exist only as long as the technological constraint that produces them, and they're insufficient. They shouldn't be mistaken for adequate governance, but they're there and they may shift as technology advances. To develop this argument, I draw on bioethicist Florencia Luna's framework of layered vulnerability. Luna has proposed understanding vulnerability not as a fixed attribute of particular groups, but as composed of layers that arise within a particular social and institutional context. So individuals may acquire multiple layers of vulnerability depending on their circumstances. A concrete example that Florencia Luna uses is the case of women seeking abortions. Being a woman is not an inherently vulnerable category, but a woman might become vulnerable if she lives in a country or a jurisdiction where reproductive rights are restricted and she seeks an abortion. Additional layers come into play if poverty, limited education, or migrant status further restrict her access to care. This framework then pushes us to ask, What resources do individuals bring to understand, absorb, and respond to risks associated with a practice like egg donation? I'll use educational attainment again as a concrete example. It's a trait the current market actively selects for and is associated with structural resources that matter. Educational attainment is tied closely to family income and later economic security. So you can see in the graphs here that individuals with higher educational attainment generally experience lower unemployment rates, higher weekly earnings, and lower rates of uninsurance. And the lower rates of uninsurance are even among individuals, all these individuals are in a similar income bracket. They may also be better positioned to navigate complex medical systems, asking questions during the informed consent process, evaluating medical risks, recognizing when their interests are not being served. This is consistent with evidence that educational level currently is associated with perceived awareness of the physical risks of egg donation. In other words, the traits the market is selected for happen to cluster with resources that buffer against harm. And I'll talk about how they buffer against harm at two junctures, when deciding whether to participate and if harms occur later. But structural privilege is not the same as protection from all harms. And the current donor pool is selected for traits that associate with structural privilege doesn't mean that donors are insulated from harms or that harms don't exist in the current market. For example, consent processes have been widely criticized for failing to convey the extent of medical uncertainty, particularly regarding long-term effects. Educational attainment may shape a donor's capacity to ask questions, but it cannot supplement information that isn't provided. And financial pressure can coexist with structural privilege. For example, in addition to altruistic motives, college students report paying tuition as a primary motivation for donating in this current market. So selecting for education doesn't select away from financial pressure or need. But resources can influence the depth and consequence of vulnerability experienced by donors. Again, it's not sufficient or reliable, but it's there, and removing them can make a fraught situation worse. Which brings me to the concept I'm working on developing and really invite feedback on. And there are slides, which is like a vast departure from egg donor ads, but I'll bring you there with me. The state of the science doesn't only determine what's technically possible, it also shapes the conditions under which people participate in the practice it enables. So let's think about a playground on a hot day. The equipment might sit in the shade of nearby trees at certain times of day, and so you can play on it, as pictured on your right, this one. There's not a canopy or a structure to keep it cool. The shade just falls there incidentally because of where the trees happen to be and where the sun happens to be at the time. So it's real protection, it works, but it's not intentional. Now it's a different time of day. The sun moves, the playground's in direct sunlight. The playground equipment is so hot to touch and there's nothing built over it. No scaffold, no shade structure to keep the playground comfortable and safe for folks to play on. This is what a technological shadow is. The state of the science casts a shadow. In this instance, the fact that you can't decouple genetic contribution from egg donation. The shadow provides protective shade to certain populations, not by design, but by circumstance. And when the capability of the technology moves, the shadow moves with it, taking the shade and leaving behind whatever lay beneath unprotected. In the case of egg donation, valuing eggs for the genetic contribution concentrated participation among donors with certain socially valued traits that were associated with structural resources that buffer against harm. The shade is not shelter, but it has offered some protections. If eggs are no longer valued for their genetic contribution, the technological shadow shifts. The shade that has fallen incidentally on current donor populations may no longer fall on those who replace them. And that raises the question, who steps into the sun? If IVG dissolves the genetic selection logic of egg donation, and if any egg donor from a medically eligible donor will do, if any egg from a medically eligible donor will do, the donor pool would likely become broader and more demographically diverse. And that's arguably preferable. A market no longer organized around elite genetic preferences, no longer sorting people by their perceived heritable worth, is a market that has shed some of its most troubling dimensions. But in markets where bodily risk is exchanged for payment, who participates and what resources they bring to the exchange is ethically relevant. As donors are valued less as individuals and more as interchangeable providers of reproductive labor, that word interchangeable is, I think, where things get really sticky. That's where my concern concentrates. Participation may increase among those who place greater weight on an immediate financial benefit relative to uncertain and poorly characterized long-term risks. So behavioral economics offers a useful framework here. People tend to discount distant and uncertain outcomes relative to immediate and certain ones, a phenomenon known as time discounting or present bias. When potential harms are ambiguous, poorly quantified, temporally distant, they may carry less psychological weight than an immediate and defined financial payment. Research further suggests that financial scarcity intensifies present bias. So individuals experiencing economic precarity are more likely to prioritize the immediate income over uncertain future outcomes. Economic precarity may therefore function as a layer of vulnerability that shapes how individuals weigh immediate financial benefits against uncertain long-term health risks. Additionally, compensation structures may shift as eggs are no longer differentiated in value based on education or other socially valued traits. Perceived interchangeability in labor can weaken bargaining power and depress wages. As compensation becomes less tied to certain traits, recruitment may expand beyond the current demographic profile and draw more heavily from individuals with fewer structural resources and greater financial need. This pattern, participation concentrating among those with fewest resources when compensated bodily material is treated as interchangeable, is not hypothetical. It's already materialized in adjacent markets, so plasma donation is a really useful analog here. Plasma donation centers in the United States are disproportionately located in lower income neighborhoods. After a plasma center opens nearby, demand for a payday loan among young borrowers decreases by 13%, suggesting that plasma donation is functioning as short-term financial relief for individuals experiencing economic precarity. Like egg donors, plasma donors balance financial benefits against medical risks. Donors commonly experience mild short-term effects such as fainting or dizziness, but the recent deaths of 2 donors linked to for-profit clinics have renewed scrutiny of frequent plasma donation. Recent research has found that long-term frequent donation can lead to physiological consequences, including depletion of iron stores, immunoglobulins, but the cumulative effect is still incompletely characterized. So when compensated bodily labor is treated as interchangeable, participation concentrates among those with the fewest resources to navigate the harm. When governance lags technology, it is those most vulnerable to exploitation who may pay the cost of that lag. If the science moves, and it may, the shadow moves with it. But we don't have to leave everyone in the hot sun. We can build a shelter to provide more permanent shade. Intentional governance must be built to create shelter where the shade is gone. The governance must address both the longstanding gaps in the regulation of egg donation and the new risks that donor-dependent IVG would introduce. Translating the need for stronger donor protections into intentional and proactive policy is complicated by many things, including the fragmented governance of assisted reproduction in the United States. So there's no federal body that governs reproductive medicine comprehensively here, unlike the HFEA in the UK, for example. And that's because, we have federalism, and so public health and clinical practice are primarily state regulated. So as you can see here, this is actually an example of surrogacy laws across state. The laws are not the same from state to state. So professional societies like the American Society for Reproductive Medicine play a big role here. They issue guidelines that shape clinical norms, but clinicians are not legally obligated to follow them. The FDA regulates some aspects of ART, but doesn't cover egg donor protections comprehensively or specifically. And medical malpractice liability is largely retrospective, so it requires an injury before standing. The result really is that egg donation remains a subject of uneven and fragmented oversight. But domestic policy alone cannot resolve these concerns. Assisted reproduction increasingly operates within transnational contexts and markets where patients, clinics, and agencies move across jurisdictions in response to regulatory differences. When protections are introduced in some jurisdictions or a practice is prohibited in certain jurisdictions, reproductive services often relocate rather than disappear. The surrogacy precedent makes this very concrete. So India and Thailand closed their large commercial surrogacy markets to foreign intended parents, and then clinics moved to Nepal and Cambodia. And then Nepal and Cambodia closed their doors. And so their arrangement shifted again to Ukraine, Georgia, Kenya, among other places. If stronger protections for egg donors emerge only in some jurisdictions, markets may optimize by migrating to settings with weaker safeguards, lower compensation standards, or limited mechanisms for monitoring donor health outcomes. Meaningful governance must therefore operate at a scale that reflects the global mobility of reproductive markets. While comprehensive international regulation remains just extremely challenging, greater coordination across jurisdictions will be necessary to ensure that donor protections travel with the market rather than being circumvented by it. So what would intentional governance actually require? Many of the protections needed are not novel. Advocates and scholars have long called for them, and they may not have been implemented or have been implemented incompletely. And some are specific to the risks that donor-dependent IVG would introduce. On the long-standing side, scholars have written extensively on this. Diane Tober, a medical anthropologist whose career is focused on ART, recently released a book that extensively outlines some of these safeguards. More robust informed consent processes that communicate not just risks, but scientific uncertainty. Donors must know what we don't know, including about long-term effects. And longitudinal health monitoring, prospective registries, enrolling donors at the time of registration. Without these, we'll never really understand the long-term implications of egg donation. 3 additional safeguards would be particularly important, though, in the IVG context specifically. First, ensuring fair terms of participation. There's prior history of professional attempts to regulate egg donor compensation. In 2011, Lindsay Kamakahi sued ASRM, SART member clinics, and agencies on behalf of egg donors. The suit challenged guidelines that limited payment to egg donors with a cap of $10,000. Kamakahi argued these guidelines constituted illegal price fixing and a per se violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. ASRM's defense pointed actually to its ethical guidelines. In 2000, ASRM's ethics committee had stated that payments to women providing oocytes should be fair, but not so substantial that they could become undue inducements to donate. The caps, ASRM argued, weren't price fixing. They were an ethical safeguard against exploitation, although, and aside from me, the justification for the specifics number they've chosen are very specious. In 2015, a court rejected ASRM's motion to dismiss. The parties settled, and as part of that settlement, ASRM removed the compensation caps from its ethical guidelines entirely. Today, ASRM issues no caps and no floors, saying only that compensation should be fair to acknowledge, quote, donors' time, inconvenience, and discomfort. So the Kamakahi litigation established real legal risk for professional associations attempting to set price ceilings on donor compensation, but ceilings and floors are different instruments serving different purposes. A ceiling limits what donors can be paid, addressing concerns about undue inducement, but a floor sets a minimum, protecting donors from exploitation and downward market pressure. If donor interchangeability increases and the traits that currently command premium compensation become irrelevant, the case for governance to ensure donors receive fair compensation, in the words of ASRM, becomes stronger. Market forces alone should not determine the terms under which individuals assume these burdens. Second, managing repeatability and cumulative risk. Current ASRM guidelines indicate that donors should undergo no more than 6 donation cycles. And the primary justification for this is to prevent consanguinity among any donor-conceived siblings. But this also incidentally protects against cumulative medical risk on the part of the donor. If the consanguinity rationale for cycle limits weakens because donor eggs are no longer contributing nuclear DNA, clinics may have financial incentives to recruit the same high-performing donors repeatedly, particularly when prior cycles yield favorable laboratory outcomes. I mean, this already happens. As you donate more times, you are paid a higher amount. Risks that appear manageable per cycle may accumulate into substantial harm over time. And frankly, repeated donation is already an issue for donors. Now, many self-report exceeding the 6 cycle limit, and there's no system to keep track across clinics. Governance should establish enforceable limits on repeat recruitment and systems for monitoring donor health and outcomes across cycles. Third, including donor voices. The development of donor-dependent IVG should include meaningful participation from egg donors in discussions about governance and oversight. Much of the early public discussion surrounding IVG assumes that the technology will eventually eliminate the need for egg donors, a vision that does not reflect the current reality. Ensuring that donors themselves have a voice in shaping governments is an important opportunity to build responsive safeguards. Ultimately, IVG is still preclinical, and that's unusual and valuable when thinking about how a technology may change what's possible and eliminate certain constraints. Legal theorist Lawrence Lessig has observed that constraints often do the work of governance. When certain behaviors are possible, law doesn't need to prohibit them. For example, and Kate shared this one with me, we have laws against stealing cars, but we don't have laws against stealing skyscrapers. We don't need to. It's not possible. We don't live in the Marvel universe. When technology removes those constraints, though, behavior can outrun governance. The technological shadow operates by that same logic. When a scientific constraint shapes who participates in a practice and on what terms, it produces incidental protections. Sometimes no intentional policy is built where that shade falls, and so the constraint itself is doing the work that governance wasn't asked to do. When the science moves, the shadow moves, and those protections can disappear before any policy is built to replace them. The preclinical stage of IVG research is a policy window. Market momentum has not yet made protections politically or economically difficult to enforce, and all the long called for safeguards for egg donors haven't been fully implemented yet. So preclinical IVG creates an opportunity to insist these protections be established before clinical translation makes enforcement harder. Establishing stronger protections now could not only mitigate foreseeable risks associated with donor-dependent IVG, it could also raise the floor for conventional egg donation. I want to close with what I think the technological shadow could offer as an anticipatory tool, one that we can apply before the science moves for other things too. Before technology shifts, we can ask, where is the shade currently falling, who's standing in it, and who will be left exposed when it shifts? In the case of egg donation and donor-dependent IVG, the shade is currently falling on a donor pool that's disproportionately highly educated, individuals whose structural resources may buffer against some of the harms of the practice that's ethically fraught. If eggs are no longer valued for their genetic contribution, that shade will move, and recruitment will no longer disproportionately favor donors with higher educational attainment and the structural privilege associated with it. The individuals who may replace current donors may face those harms with fewer resources to absorb them. The opportunity at this preclinical moment is to insist protections be met before the science moves and takes the shade with it. With that, I want to thank you for your time and your attention and for the insightful questions I know are coming. And a particular thank you to Amy for all of her coordination. First, my sincerest gratitude goes to Professor Kate Spector-Baghdadi. She took a chance on a National Academies program officer with an unconventional trajectory, who wanted to make a different kind of contribution, and she's just an extraordinary mentor. I'm gonna look away from you so I don't get sappy. Her feedback is always a gift, honest, rigorous, and delivered straight, and I'm deeply grateful for everything she's taught me about how to think, write, and argue in this field. To the Spector Lab, Carrie, Jesse, Carly, and Katie, thank you for the opportunity to learn from you and alongside you. A special thank you to lab friend, Dr. Takunda Matose, for his thoughtful feedback on my manuscript. To Michigan bioethics faculty, staff, students, thank you for cultivating such a wonderful training environment and the unique ability among bioethics fellowships to see clinical ethics in action. And thanks to everyone for your attention, and I look forward to questions. Eight.
Thank you so much. This was really good. It was really good. It's hard to pack that much science and ethics and policy into 45 minutes, and you nailed it. So that was great. I have so many questions, which is strange given how many times I've read the paper. But I guess one bigger question I have, and don't forget to repeat it into the mic, is what concept of the technological shadow? You applied it really well for us in the egg donation context. What else could it do for us? Like, do you have any other thoughts on like a science advancement? Sorry, this is a hard one. I know you're giving me that look. I'm supposed to start with a softball. But like, what else do you think it can do for us as a concept? Like, if we're going to start citing the Packard Dawson, like technological shadow concept, like what do you hope this framework might bring to the field?
First, thank you for the question. I will repeat it. It is essentially what are maybe potentially other circumstances that we could apply the technological shadow to, and how could it be used as a tool for the field? And I've been thinking a lot about this because I would love to have another really juicy, concrete example. And I don't have a perfect one, but I've been thinking about it a lot. I'm just not sure it's quite perfect around really AI, which is like everyone's favorite buzzword, but AI is opening so many doors of things that we never thought were possible before. And it's making places where it's taking away a lot of constraints. And so it's going to leave certain populations or even like just processes vulnerable in ways that they weren't before. So that's an imperfect answer because I do want a juicier, specific answer than that. And then as to the other, I think that this is one of the things I'm really excited about, bringing a hard science background to, is really inviting more conversations between scientists and ethicists. That's where the ethicists will get the picture of like, oh, this is at its nascent stages. Let's really anticipate and think about what this could change. And then using this as a tool to think about that and build more anticipatory governance, recognizing that sometimes it's hard to do that until something feels real. But I often think bioethicists are coming into conversations when something's like literally at the 11th hour. And that's not a great time to get things going.
Great.
Yes, Dr. Schumann.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. I'm trying to think of other situations in which financial incentives, as well as the desire to help others, intertwine. And the one that keeps coming to me is volunteers for clinical research when they're getting paid, where there's a very big difference in risk from an observational survey-based evaluation to being intentionally infected with you fill in the blank. How does the shadow analogy or your presentation here benefit from thinking about egg donors analogously to people getting paid to be a part of research?
That's a really interesting question. And I think Hastings actually just had a piece on that. That was good. I think, yes. And the question that Dr. Schumann asked was thinking about clinical research subjects who are taking on risks in exchange for payment, and how can this be useful in thinking about that context. And while I agree that there's this asymmetry there, I think the difference of this specific instance is that there's about to be a technology that's like a lightning bolt and changes everything. So while I agree that egg donation and taking on risk for research can be very similar in terms of thinking about the distribution of burdens, this is like thinking if there was some sort of just boom that changed everything in terms of how we currently regulate research subjects research. But that's an interesting population to consider as being vulnerable in this kind of way.
I have a question from online.
Yes.
Okay. Is there potential for mitochondrial DNA to be seen as a new additional other way to differentiate egg donors and recreate eugenics concerns? Is there something to anticipate in this space when we think more broadly about denucleated egg donation?
The question from online was about whether mitochondrial DNA could essentially give a new element of eugenics, another thing to consider heritability through. And this is something I really thought about when making the paper, because I wasn't sure how much of mitochondria to bring in, because it can be a little wonky for non-scientists. I think generally it's thought that the mitochondrial DNA doesn't confer the kinds of heritable traits that people are generally selecting for in the market. So I have dove into it and I'm not particularly concerned. And also, people can find all new kinds of ways to sort people. It's kind of astounding. So you could particularly see, for instance, Jewish people who carry some conditions that deal with mitochondrial problems. That could be, then couldn't possibly include any of them, even though we do like pretty extensive prenatal genetic risk screening. So you could see something like that, but I don't think it'll be on the same level as what we see with nuclear DNA, just based on what's passed down through your nuclear DNA versus what's passed down in your mitochondrial DNA.
Can I do another one? Oh, no, you go.
Claire?
Thanks so much. You did a really hard problem. Hard problem. You did it very well. It's hard. I'm getting a sense of nihilism about how this problem could be solved. What are your suggestions for how a model policy might be introduced at this stage, and what would that look like?
For egg donation specifically? Or just like broad?
Sure.
Okay, great. Love it. Dr. Berkler asked, sort of noted maybe a sense of nihilism around this, and asked like how to build a model policy so we can actually have something that works. And you're right to get a sense of nihilism, because anything that's in a global market does become particularly tricky. And also, I think we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of good. I think that the main thing that I would recommend across egg donation is starting to actually longitudinally track how egg donors are doing long-term. There's research to indicate that many donors would be willing to opt into such a kind of registry, and it wouldn't be impossible to think about doing that on a voluntary basis globally. And so that's a first step to actually understanding what's happening to people long-term, which is gonna have all kinds of downward ethical dividends in terms of being able to be more clear and informed consent and give people a better picture of what they're signing on to. So that would be my first pick.
Okay, we have a question about gender. So obviously, all of these technologies are very gender associated, and you didn't talk a ton about gender influences this, but also it seems like in one of your slides, perhaps the same technology could be used to put DNA into sperm. Is that like,
so? Yeah.
Like gender and the science,
yes,
and like what's happening?
Absolutely. First of all, this is fascinating. I took it. Oh, yes. The question is talking about how this technology could deal with, like, is it only for women? Is it only for people with XX chromosomes, et cetera, and how can it address like social related infertility? So first of all, I really wanted to include this in, but it just became like, it ballooned everything. So I'm so happy to have this question. So first of all, in vitro gametogenesis is being used and is being researched to generate lab-derived eggs and lab-derived sperm. And what I said for mice, they've been able to do that for sperm as well, and they've generated offspring, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that's pretty exciting that they've done in mice is they were able to, using induced pluripotent stem cells, make a male mice, an XY mouse, have a lab-derived egg. So then they were able to generate offspring from 2 male mice and offspring from those offspring. And there's, again, a lot to research and be interested in there. And it was really low rates of success because essentially they had to wait for an XY cell to kick out its Y chromosome. Really interesting stuff. But yes, the long-term vision would be to enable not just older women or people with XX chromosomes who have infertility. This would be possible for people regardless of how they identify their gender identity, to have genetically related children together. And there's a lot of great literature about how that's really a matter of justice to be able to expand fertility options to those folks. And it's one of the biggest, I would say a lot of people in this space, particularly on the commercial end, are gay men who really envision a future where they can have a genetically related child with their partner.
Can I do one more from online?
Yeah, of course.
The legal one, so obviously I picked it. So you showed us a graphic of all of the states and the states' different laws about surrogacy and genetic surrogacy, and it's all over the place. And I think that perhaps states might be interested in regulating this as well. But when I looked at the map, there doesn't seem to be a rhyme or reason politically for why different states are associated with different legal outcomes, which is, what we usually find. And so the question is about what's driving the current surrogacy laws politically, and what could we anticipate from different sections of the country in the future? Right now it seems random. Do you have any theory of what's happening?
So the question was, what's driving surrogacy laws across different states? Just sort of noting that in the slide, it seemed kind of random. And I don't have a concrete answer, but this is my thought, is that fertility is, again, very personal to people, and it tends to go across lines. We're seeing that now post-Dobbs, where there are folks who are more politically conservative who are still trying to preserve access to IVF. And so surrogacy and egg donation can fall in a similar space. And so it's often based on just having someone who's really motivated and has a lot of lobbying power in a specific state. Egg donation is also pretty random. I couldn't find as good of a map, and frankly, there are fewer laws. So that's true. But one specific example I want to give is that in Colorado, they've made a law that was advocated for by donor-conceived children for transparency from their donors. I don't know what about Colorado made them more like permissive for that kind of regulation, but my guess would just be that was a motivated person, or maybe even someone within the political machinations who was motivated on that element. So yeah, it is a bit random.
So your theory is that it's not that the state politically leans one way or another, it's like where specific problems or cases or people who want to be champions.
Yeah. So Kate said essentially that it's not by political, by political identity. It's more a little bit random based on where there's a champion. And probably someone has a better answer for me than this, but I think so. I don't think it perfectly aligns because there are red states that are permissive towards egg donation and surrogacy and vice versa. Although there are certainly more religiously conservative folks that aren't permissive or agree with these practices.
Awesome. Well, I think that's probably all we have time for.
Thanks everyone for joining us online, and thanks to the people in the room.